beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, it was a realm of divine order. The earth was without form and void, and darkness covered the deep like the troubled dreams of a sleepless night. It dwelled, banished from the light, among and without those who once walked its hallowed grounds. The roach found himself in a pool of moisture, rolled halfway onto what he once thought to be his back. Or was it my side, he thought, as his limbs tickled with an unfamiliar numbness. Somehow, he could not recollect the exact composition of what was supposed to be his original form. He laid for quite some time, and despite having zero sense of urgency or purpose, it troubled him that he hadn't attempted to rise out of this stasis. The sun had yet not risen, however. There remained an underlying inch that prevented the roach from falling back into the orbit of another hour of slumber. It's almost very much so, maddening, as he lies alone, with each molecule of his body equally demanding action and inaction. At any moment, he could explode to his feet and find something to do, something small even, to make himself feel anything less like a rotting fruit waiting to collapse into its own core. For another set of impatiently counted minutes, the roach continued to recollect or rediscover his own body's quite lumpful shape. The skin on his cheeks observed the ever-present tickle of a mop of curled and matted hair. He raised an arm to pull back the obstruction with an outstretched palm, to brush away the veil from his sight. Yet, as he reached for the front of his face, he was met with the sensation of rubbing the back of his skull. He searched again through the brush of furrowed locks, crawling his fingers around its perimeter, just to be met by the same sensation around the other hemisphere. The roach was faceless, left in banishment, without companionship, to roll around this darkened capsule of his bedroom blind. Yet, he could still witness a warm glow through the blinds of his chambers, slowly getting brighter, revealing the hard surface reflections of paneled wood walls and uniformly dark oak shelving. It's as if he was watching his own individual perspective in the third person, like a spectator in his own abominably conglomerated shell. He didn't need a pair of ears to hear the beads of his own drippings crashing to earth in a rhythmic plop. He didn't need an armada of eager taste buds to inform the sickened taste of an unwashed mouth. These were sensations the roach sat and experienced almost journalistically for another few minutes in bed. I find myself ever inspired by my senses, the roach thought, as he continued to wander his fingertips around the equator of his cranium, before turning north to reach one of the poles where one would typically discover a scalp. This time, however, his tactile expedition was met with the warmth of another. "Hello? Who's there?" he gurgled, without an orifice of which to protect his own words. No response. So he felt further, running the tips of his fingers past the seam that fused this stranger to his coiled and frizzy mane. Its skin was of no discernible temperature nor texture, as it was identical to that of its own. The roach's hands ventured forth, accounting for the parts of this attachment with a meticulous need for understanding and documentation. A pair of supple shoulders, followed by a muscular yet skinny elbow, and two rather limp and small hands, the roach distinguished the naturalism of this form, as if it was created as a perfect sculpture of flesh, and compared his own deformities to that of his other half. 2 stumps, 4 breasts, 3 belly buttons, and a rather thick coat of blubber. continued to brighten, as the moonlight reflected orange radiance of the sun rising a few minutes past the horizon. The visibility only enhanced how conscious the roach was of his own imperfection. His body was far larger and more grotesque than that of his vestigial twin. Realizing just how much of the room he was colonizing with his imposing presence. Just as I discovered myself, why do I hate him so? The roach contemplated in a spiral of dejection. The light further highlighted the many object contours that surrounded its periphery. Rags stained with sauces, wrappers that still linger the scent of artificial sweetness are scattered about. A refrigerator, left nearly empty with a sticky brown tint, calls to comfort his sorrowful hunger. The pit left in his stomach from the discovery of himself demands to be potted and filled with a cement of caloric glue. So, he reaches with his now too large arms for the glisten of an apple resting at the very edge of his bed. He reaches for the fruit, which he now knows will only fatten him further with its tempting sweetness, but he reaches nonetheless. The roach's fingertip limply glides forth, inches from contact between the fruit and flesh, ready to be met with a tantalizing and smooth treat. He pauses just before the cataclysm to think to himself, without a mouth to deposit this fuel, I'll never know the glory of its natural sugars. If only I had a mouth, yet I'm cursed with the hands to feel what I cannot have. He reaches for the apple anyway, for at the moment of collision the sky becomes miraculously illuminated as a white, hot light cuts through the window blinds. The roach's palms were not met by the cool skin of a fresh crop, but now squelching meat, skin, and dual rows of teeth. His punishment for his many sins was not an excommunication from the kingdom of God, but the power of creation itself, and the curious yearning to harness his own full potential as an artist. The pair, having been reformed at a uniquely upright position, without much downward force, slowly tipped to one side, as if in its inanimateness, the newborn needed a moment to catch its breath. Roach patiently watched, palms still steaming from the heat of the spontaneous formation. He rested them atop his knee in a playfully curious manner. "Oh, sweet friend of mine, I sense your courteous grin from the shine on your molars. Be unafraid. I await our conversation and your companionship," he announced through an orchestra of hums originating deep within his chest cavity. Still awaiting a response from that of its vestigial twin. This time, he approached the stranger with a neighborly lack of urgency. Waiting only enhanced the hyperfixation. How, with each newly tailed crevasse of flesh, added to the accumulating itch that tries to, with great force, to divert his attention from waiting for the pair to display even a hangnail's weight of gratitude. "I've waited, yet you remain speechless. Speak, dear friend, with the mouth I've sculpted for you. A gift of my finite clay, an orifice transplanted from I to you." The roach's impatience with the sociability of this teeth-clad fruit compounded with an insatiable hunger. The initial joy that came from the discovery of Genesis faded into a disdain for the fruit. It failed to meet the expectations, and despite the roach's sacrifice, it didn't bother to attempt to use the parts in which it was given. He spent those early minutes with the pair, as any creator does, stepping back and observing the glory of its completed state. A finished painting, with a tidal wave of expectations, fit to pop the cork of this ever-draining heart. Loving his hard work unabashedly, with its wholeness existing proudly in context to its own present potential. Within a few moments, its former traits with admiration, its glittering teeth, soft and hairless skin, were picked to ribbed bone. In its wake was another from which to tally flaws, a waste of effort, a tool without purpose, falsely fired terracotta. Roach hated it and pictured himself, able and keen to take it to some field unseen, to burn away from the presence of what could be. It wears him out. So, he reaches for the fruit and squeezes it with a minor explosion of pus before whipping the pear with his long arm like a trebuchet against the far wall. A burst of compulsion overtook him, leading to action. He watched as it flagged like a gliding dove, gracefully crashing itself into the doorframe, as if it was blinded by the polished glass of a high-rise apartment. It sticks in like a thunk, then a squelch, staying for almost a whole second before sliding down to meet the floor. It rests there for a while, dwelling in its own drippings. The roach lowered its head in defeat, taking the time to continue and try to fall back asleep. The pear, despite remaining clearly dead, began to vibrate, starting to shuffle its way back towards the door. Some force seemed to be pulling it against it, before the lump of meat managed to force it open. The wooded gateway swung wide to swallow a brisk gulp of morning air, filling the roach's room with a chromatic rush of light, thoughtfully bounced from the early Richmond landscape. The itch of stasis and the strangled need to force growth moved the roach to wander, tucking his hands into his armpits to avoid accidentally converting the floor beneath him. The roach used his elbows like knees to hobble towards the light like a moth. Despite this form being much larger than the doorframe, he pressed forth to realize his bones were far more gelatinous than he initially encountered. He scuttled off the porch with a primitive urge to find his new canvas, a new slab of marble from which to free an imprisoned subject in grave need of a savior. He needed his art to speak back, to praise him for his devotion and faith. The roach didn't bother to pause, as he often did, with a careful need to cherish his surroundings, forcing an epiphany through repetitive and obsessive sequences of muscle contractions, not stopping to see how the light glimmered of clumps of varied leaves, or how the tungsten glow of the Libby Hill street lamps turned the concrete to bronze. He slipped down the grassy hillside, face up at the base of his townhouse cocoon, its blade still left slick from the nightly dew, all while still dangling his vestigial appendage, whom Roach began to address as a pet as he wandered through the park's curling paths. It's odd. We hang from each other's scalps, bound at the equal peak of our forms. I'm numb to your senses, assuming you are to mine, but I can feel your warmth. There is no egotistical well of confidence brewing within him. So, to his twin himself, he conceived a mantra. Thank you for guiding me here. This bench will be my masterpiece. I will craft her with the will of my last breath, to manifest her companionship and hopefully long straight legs. He reached his massive hand forth to tap the seat into sentience, focusing his creative efforts with the blind intention to outshine the existence of the pear itself, excavating the flooded grounds where he once loved all his creations, and burying the remaining water under the weight of expectations. Making things are like digging a quarry, an ever-growing hole in the ground that has an insatiable need to take an exponential piece of yourself each time you seek to dig deeper. The water at the bottom stays stagnant and ever-present as more dirt needs to be removed. Every time you try to lower the flood further into the ground, the sediment gets harder packed and your tools dull. Eventually, the hole will get so deep and narrow that you'll be lucky to reach bedrock before the water has gone up to your neck. In a flash of white light, the fingertip of Roach made contact with the bench's leg, born with a myopic fixation on creating something meaningful, with its only purpose being a circular paradox to validate the Roach's compulsive ideation. Of course, it would be just as much a voluptuous pile of flesh as him and his other self-extensions. The bench was truly grotesque, an offsetting abomination that should be tucked away. Spotlighted, it reveals a veinous and slimy understructure that resembled what can only be described as the lining of organs. Cresting its back, rising outwards like a fan of bones, as a form of supposed lumbar support, is a row of ribs. Without the immediate sentimental attachment to this creation, he didn't even bother to carefully observe its lessons, despite making something that at face value was a display of his technical proficiency with the gift. If it was, in terms of biomass, he far surpassed his previous record. The Roach turned and continued to wander, leaving the bench to be forgotten as he marched forth without seeing the larger picture. As the Roach continued to scoot down the path towards the horizon, a soft pulse thumped on in a whisper. His encumbered form limped into the tree line and passed an empty street of cold lights before vanishing. The veins of the bench squeezed a final burst of fluids throughout its leaking delta of half-closed tubing. The bench was burned from the warmth of contact and died at the shock of its absence. Roach scooted along train tracks that ran parallel to the James for miles, slipping through deep brush with his arms tucked in to avoid forming another bench. He spots a rising mass in the distance. It must be a cloud diffusing the glow of the midday sky. Or have I spotted the flame of another explorer in these eerily familiar lands? After emerging from the enclosure of the umbrella canopy, the Roach traces the smoke from above, down to the vast clearing. An old farm stands with prominence against a darkened wall of pine. The sky speckled hints of the start of golden hour through a web of branches. The smoke draws him in as he glides through the wild grass to inspect its point of origin. It's a steaming pile of ash, encircling a rather curvaceous piece of charcoal. Here lies the blackened stem of an apple tree, the centerpiece of a seemingly days-old bonfire. The structure of this tree initially shocks the Roach. Its trunk bends with a rhythm that can only be described as elegant and slender, a stark contrast to that of his own barreled chest and fattened hips. Entirely convinced that this curved and knotted lump of wood could be, with the touch of a hand devoted to craftsmanship, turned and carved into his final companion, a warm place for Roach to bury his bone. So, the Roach crawled onto the smoldering embers on top of his quadrupedal nubs, melting his blubber like butter, driven by the supposition that anything or anyone can live up to the pedestal of a creator's expectations. This insect is willing to fly into the light of a flame to avoid another night, aware he's without the embrace of a partner. This worthless bug touched the tree and was certain that his solitude was destiny. Her form was feminine. Her pale and delicate waist softly defined her abdominal muscles. You can see the rosiness of her exposed skin as its heat blows into the air, leaving the woman windswept as she rests lifelessly on the ground. How the warmth of the reflective light fills the shadows of her bottom. It defines how gracefully her form rests atop the sticks and coals. The roach accounted for her beauty, how she was created in his perfect image, and how lifeless she looked. Despite such glorious construction, he knew he lost her. The roach's once towering form slumped even further, so he wandered further downriver. The roach had attached all of his worth and his infinite gift of life to his crafted companion. So, in failing to create her as he had lost himself, I'm not here. This isn't happening. The roach repeated to himself in a flurry of disassociation as he shambled through more vegetation before realizing in his blinded state of tunnel vision there was no longer a ground beneath him from which to scurry. The roach tumbled down, a distant pilot to his own ship, listening to the scrapes and cracks of his fracturing frame as he rolled into an old quarry like a symphony of red alerts. Pain was no longer of concern to him. He splashes into the wellspring below and sinks to the bottom, comfortably numb and ready for the water pressure to burst his eardrums. Deafening lullaby. Roach rests at the bottom of the river in a cushion of soot. It speckles from the fool's gold that cuts through the upkick of its dark accumulations. The neurons in the roach's brain begin to crackle into nothingness, with asphyxia surrounding his consciousness, ordered in a tentacled vignette. In his grand destruction, he feels a connection with a part of himself once lost. His once paralytic twin uses the bottom of its feet and clasps within them a ball of muck. They demand a final sculpture from his fading cortex. They float out of the water as if they became of a perfectly neutral buoyancy and rest atop the water's plane like a mirror. The attachment opened its cupped feet to reveal a clay doll, sculpted with the care of its last-minute creative Hail Mary. It lowers the doll to the roach. It raised the doll to the roach, for his vestige had gifted him the greatest of lessons. It has to come from within. You can't see a fruit and just demand it to grow legs to guide you. You can't force a park bench or the loss of one to spoon-feed you an epiphany. A creator scoops the earth from where they stand, for even when their fingertips reach the heavens, the soil that grounds our souls to this place cannot be neglected. The love of the whole is the first step to projecting its potential glory outward. A man appears at the opposite end of the roach's fingertip in its place. He stands alone, atop the water's surface tension, finger pointed at nothing but a dove in the distant sky, free to walk the earth as his complete form, a person free to grow without the need to analyze and reconfigure his surroundings, content with his only responsibility being fulfilled by living for his own satisfaction.